moment I stepped into the King County Courthouse, I knew my parents believed they had already won. They sat confidently at the plaintiff's table, perfectly composed, exchanging quiet smiles as if the outcome were a formality. To everyone else in the room, they looked respectable, successful professionals who had simply come to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. And I was just the daughter they had left behind more than 20 years ago. But everything changed after my Aunt Evelyn Brooks passed away. She was the one who raised me after my parents dropped me off at her home in Bainbridge Island, Washington, with a suitcase and a promise they never kept. She never spoke badly of them. She never tried to replace them. She simply stayed. In her will, she left everything to me. Her house, her savings, her quiet legacy. Now, the same people who once said they'd be back soon were suing me, claiming I had manipulated her, isolated her, taken advantage of her kindness. I stood still as the judge reviewed the file. The courtroom was hushed, heavy with expectation. Then he looked up. His gaze paused on me longer than necessary. "You were raised by Evelyn Brooks," he said slowly. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. The judge leaned back slightly, his expression shifting, subtle but unmistakable. "I knew her," he said quietly. "She testified in this court years ago." The silence that followed felt different. Across the aisle, my parents stiffened, because in that moment I understood something they didn't. This case was no longer about inheritance. It was about whether the truth she lived by would be allowed to stand. The judge's words lingered in the air longer than they should have. "I knew her," he had said. "Evelyn Brooks." My parents shifted almost imperceptibly at the plaintiff's table. It was the smallest movement, my mother adjusting her posture, my father's hand tightening around a pen. But I noticed. I had learned, long ago, to read the quiet signals people gave when certainty began to loosen. "Yes, Your Honor," I repeated softly. "She raised me." The judge nodded once, as if confirming a detail already written somewhere in his mind. Then he looked back down at the file, and the courtroom exhaled. That single sentence pulled me backward in time. Not to a courtroom, but to a gray afternoon on Bainbridge Island when I was 7 years old and still believed promises were solid things. The ferry horn echoed faintly from the harbor as my parents' car rolled into the narrow driveway of a cedar-sided house overlooking the water. My suitcase sat between my feet, too big for a short visit, too heavy for a child to carry without help. My mother knelt in front of me, smoothing my hair as if she were straightening something she planned to leave behind. "Stay with Aunt Evelyn for a little while," she said lightly, "just until we get things sorted." Sorted was another word I would learn not to trust. My father was already checking his phone, half-turned toward the car. "We'll be back before you know it," he added, not looking at me. I nodded because nodding felt safer than asking questions. The front door opened before I could say anything else. Aunt Evelyn Brooks stood there, her sweater slightly crooked, her glasses pushed up into her hair. She didn't rush. She didn't smile too widely. She simply looked at me, then at my parents, and understood everything without asking. "Come inside," she said gently, resting a hand on my shoulder. I remember the sound of the car pulling away more clearly than their faces, gravel shifting, an engine fading, the quiet afterward stretching longer than expected. Evelyn closed the door behind us and set my suitcase down by the wall. "They didn't explain," I whispered. "No," she said. "They usually don't." That was the beginning. Life with Evelyn was calm in a way that felt intentional. She woke early, brewed strong coffee, and read the newspaper from front to back. She believed mornings set the tone for everything else. "People tell you what matters by what they write down," she used to say, tapping the page, "and what they leave out." Evelyn had spent most of her life working as a court reporter and later as an expert witness in civil cases. She believed deeply in records, in precision, in saying exactly what you meant while there was still time. "Memory bends," she told me once. "Transcripts don't." She never spoke badly of my parents, not once. She didn't need to. Silence did the work for her. As the years passed, Bainbridge Island became home in ways I hadn't expected. The house smelled of old books and sea air. The creak of the stairs became familiar. Evelyn never tried to replace anyone. She simply stayed. When I asked if my parents would come back, she never lied. "Some people return," she said carefully. "Some people only revisit the idea." By the time I was 12, she had begun showing me her old notebooks, rows of neat handwriting, dates carefully marked, margins filled with small clarifications. Details matter, she said, especially when someone decides to change the story later. I didn't know then how important those lessons would become. Evelyn aged quietly. She slowed, but she never lost her clarity. Even when her hands began to shake slightly, her notes remained steady. When she revised her will, she did it with the same care she gave everything else. She called her attorney. She documented every conversation. She explained her reasons plainly. "This isn't about gratitude," she told me once. "It's about responsibility." I thought about that as I stood in the courtroom years later, my parents accusing me of manipulation, of influence, of taking advantage of a woman they had left behind without a second thought. They saw money. I saw the person who had chosen to stay. As Judge Harold Mercer prepared to open the hearing, I felt something unexpected settle over me. Not fear, not anger, readiness. This wasn't about defending myself. It was about allowing the truth Evelyn had lived by, quietly, precisely, to speak for itself. And for the first time since this began, I knew I was exactly where she would have wanted me to be, standing still, on the record, ready to let the truth do the rest. The lawsuit arrived 3 weeks after Evelyn's funeral, not by phone, not by conversation, by certified mail. I was standing in the kitchen when the envelope slid through the slot, its edges crisp, impersonal. My name was typed neatly on the front, followed by an address I had lived at for nearly 20 years. The return label bore the seal of a downtown Seattle law firm. I already knew what it was. Still, my hands hesitated before opening it. Inside was a formal notice of civil action. Plaintiffs, Mark and Linda Brooks. Claim, undue influence, coercion, isolation. I read it once, then again more slowly. According to the filing, I had deliberately distanced Evelyn from her family. I had interfered with her medical care. I had manipulated her into revising her will in my favor during a period of declining health. The words were clinical, efficient, carefully chosen. They described a woman I did not recognize, and a version of myself that had never existed. I set the papers down on the table and looked out the window toward the water. The ferry was crossing the Sound, steady and indifferent, exactly on schedule. Evelyn would have noticed that. She believed timing revealed intent. My attorney, Rachel Kim, arrived that afternoon. She was calm, measured, the kind of person who listened more than she spoke. "They're filing in King County," she said after reviewing the documents. "They're claiming you exercised control." I nodded. She warned me this might happen. Rachel glanced up. "She did?" "Yes," I said. "She documented everything." That changed Rachel's posture slightly. Not surprise, but respect. In the days that followed, the house became quieter, but not tense. I opened drawers I hadn't touched since Evelyn's death. Inside were labeled folders, stacked carefully, each one a piece of foresight. Medical evaluations, witness statements, correspondence. Evelyn hadn't prepared for a fight. She had prepared for accuracy. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, I found a notebook tucked behind a row of law books. On the inside cover, she had written a single line: "If they return, it will not be to ask how you are." I closed the book gently. Rachel and I met again 2 days later. She spread the documents across the dining table, arranging them not as evidence, but as a timeline. She revised her will twice, Rachel said. Both times with witnesses, both times with medical clearance. "She was very deliberate," I said. Rachel nodded. "That's what protects you." The first hearing was scheduled quickly. On the morning of the preliminary conference, my parents arrived early. They sat together, close enough to suggest unity, distant enough to maintain appearances. My mother's expression was soft, almost sorrowful. My father's was tight, restrained. They didn't look at me. Their attorney, Paul Anders, spoke first. "This case involves a vulnerable elderly woman," he said, his tone smooth, practiced, "and a niece who had exclusive access during her final years." I felt Rachel stiffen beside me. When she stood, her voice was calm. "Evelyn Brooks was a former court reporter and expert witness," she said. "She understood documentation better than most. The record will reflect that." The judge listened without comment. That night, back at the house, I sat at Evelyn's old desk and opened one of her journals. Her handwriting was steady, even near the end. "People confuse kindness with weakness," one entry read. "They are not the same." I thought about the years my parents had been absent, the birthdays they had missed, the holidays Evelyn had quietly filled with routine instead of excuses. They hadn't wanted involvement then, only inheritance now. The realization didn't sting the way I expected. It clarified something. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about revision. They wanted to rewrite the ending without acknowledging the middle. And as I closed the journal and turned off the lamp, I understood the role Evelyn had prepared me for. Not as a defender, but as a witness. Someone who would stand still while the record spoke. Someone who would not interrupt the truth with emotion. Someone who would let the story remain exactly as it had been lived, quietly, deliberately, on the record. The formal hearings began on a Tuesday morning, under a sky that looked undecided. Gray clouds hovered over King County Courthouse, heavy but unmoving, as if waiting for something to shift. Inside, the air carried the familiar scent of paper and polished wood, order layered over quiet tension. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table, angled slightly toward each other. They looked prepared, rehearsed, the kind of calm that comes from believing the story has already been written. I took my seat beside Rachel Kim, my hands folded loosely in my lap. Judge Harold Mercer entered without ceremony. The room rose, then settled. "Counsel," he said evenly, "you may proceed." My parents' attorney, Paul Anders, stood first. "This case," he began, "is about undue influence, about a woman in declining health whose dependence on a single caregiver created an environment ripe for manipulation." His words were careful, clinical. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke of proximity, of access, of isolation. I listened without reaction. Rachel waited until he finished, then rose. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "this case is about documentation, about intent recorded consistently over time." She placed the first exhibit before the clerk. The sound of paper sliding across the desk felt louder than it should have. The first witness was Evelyn's former primary care physician. Yes, the doctor testified, Evelyn experienced physical decline typical for her age. Paul Anders stepped forward smoothly. "Including moments of confusion." The doctor shook her head. "No, her cognition remained intact." "Did she rely on my client's niece for transportation and scheduling?" "She relied on her for assistance," the doctor replied, "not for decisions." Rachel followed up. "Did Evelyn Brooks ever express uncertainty about her estate planning?" "Never," the doctor said. "She was precise." The next witness was a longtime neighbor from Bainbridge Island. "She was sharp," the woman testified. "Even near the end, she talked about her will openly." Paul pressed. "Did you ever see her family visit?" The neighbor hesitated. "No, not often." Rachel intervened. "Did Evelyn ever complain about that?" "No," the woman said. She said people make choices. By midday, the courtroom felt different. Not louder, more focused. During the break, my father passed me in the hallway. "You could have shared," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "She shared her life. You didn't want it." He looked away. When court resumed, Paul introduced a stack of emails, selective excerpts, highlighted phrases pulled from context. "Exclusive access," he said. "Control over communication." Rachel stood. "May we present the full correspondence?" Judge Mercer nodded. The full emails told a different story. Evelyn declining visits that came with conditions. Evelyn refusing conversations about money. Evelyn insisting on clarity. Paul's jaw tightened. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. Judge Mercer leaned forward, his gaze moving from the documents to me. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "you lived with Evelyn for many years." "Yes, Your Honor." "Did she ever ask your opinion about her will?" I answered carefully. "She informed me after decisions were made. She didn't seek approval." The judge nodded slowly. "I knew Evelyn Brooks," he said, almost to the room rather than to me. "She testified here years ago, very exacting." Paul shifted in his seat. That single sentence changed the atmosphere. The rest of the afternoon passed with fewer objections, fewer dramatics. The record spoke clearly, steadily, without urgency. That evening, back at the house, I opened one of Evelyn's journals again. When people lose control of the future, she had written, they try to reclaim the past. I closed the book. Tomorrow, I would take the stand. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, I understood exactly what my role was. Not to argue, not to persuade, but to speak plainly and then let the truth, already recorded, finish what it had begun. I took the stand the next morning. The courtroom felt smaller than it had the day before, as if the walls had leaned in overnight to listen more closely. Judge Harold Mercer watched as I was sworn in, his expression neutral but attentive, the look of someone who valued accuracy over performance. Rachel Kim began quietly, "Please state your name for the record." "My name is Elena Brooks," I said. Paul Anders lifted his gaze for the first time that morning. "Elena," Rachel continued, "how long did you live with your aunt, Evelyn Brooks?" "Since I was 7, I replied, "until the day she passed." "And during that time, did she ever express uncertainty about her estate decisions?" "No," I said. "She was deliberate, always." Rachel nodded. "Did she discuss those decisions with you?" "Yes," I said, "but not to ask my opinion. She informed me." Paul stood smoothly, buttoning his jacket as he approached. "Ms. Brooks," he said, pacing slowly, "isn't it true that you depended on Evelyn financially?" "I was a minor when I moved in," I answered evenly. "She was my guardian." "And later?" he pressed. "I supported myself," I said. "I worked. I contributed to the household." He stopped pacing. "But you lived in her home." "Yes," I said, "at her request." Paul tilted his head. "Isn't it possible that your closeness influenced her decisions?" I didn't hesitate. Influence requires persuasion. She didn't ask for mine. A murmur passed through the gallery. Paul shifted direction. "Did you ever limit your parents' access to Evelyn?" "No," I said, "she did." He raised an eyebrow. "Convenient." Judge Mercer's voice cut in. "Counsel." Paul nodded slightly. "Let's be specific. Did you ever intercept calls?" "No." "Withhold mail?" "No." "Suggest she revise her will?" "No." He paused, then asked, "You benefited significantly from her death, didn't you?" I met his eyes. "I benefited from her life." The room went still. Rachel stood again. "Elena, why do you believe Evelyn left her estate to you?" I took a breath. "Because she believed responsibility should follow presence. She raised me. She trusted me." Paul scoffed softly. "Trust isn't legal proof." Rachel turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce Evelyn Brooks' personal journals." Folders were passed forward. Rachel read aloud. "I am not confused. I am not pressured. I am precise." Paul objected. "These are personal reflections." Judge Mercer glanced at the page, then back at Paul. "They speak directly to intent." Overruled. Rachel continued, "My niece has never asked me for anything. That is exactly why I trust her with everything." My throat tightened, not with grief, but recognition. Paul rose again. "Your Honor, emotional language does not establish capacity." Judge Mercer's gaze sharpened. "Intent and capacity are precisely what this court is examining." Paul sat. Rachel asked one final question. "Elena, did your aunt ever anticipate this lawsuit?" "Yes," I said. "She prepared for it." "How?" "She documented everything." Judge Mercer nodded once. "You may step down." As I returned to my seat, I felt a strange calm settle in. Not relief, not triumph, but completion. During the break, my mother brushed past me in the hallway. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "You could have kept things private." I met her eyes. She already did. That night, I sat alone in Evelyn's study, the house quiet around me. I didn't open files or reread testimony. I stood by the window and watched the water beyond the trees, steady and indifferent. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, but the truth had already been spoken, quietly, clearly, on the record. The final day of testimony arrived without ceremony. There were no raised voices in the hallway, no reporters pressing forward, only the quiet shuffle of papers and the low murmur of attorneys preparing to say the same things one last time, hoping repetition might bend meaning. My parents sat closer together than before, not in unity but necessity. Their certainty had thinned into something brittle, held together by posture and silence. Paul Anders reviewed his notes repeatedly, tapping the corner of the table as if grounding himself. Judge Harold Mercer entered and took his seat. "We'll proceed with closing testimony," he said. "Counsel." Paul stood first. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about whether Evelyn Brooks was organized or intelligent. It's about emotional dependence, about a woman who relied on one person so completely that objectivity became impossible." He turned slightly toward me. "Proximity creates influence." The phrase hung in the air, polished, plausible, familiar. Rachel Kim waited until he finished, then rose. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "proximity can also create responsibility." She placed a final exhibit beneath the document camera. A handwritten letter appeared on the screen, dated several months before Evelyn's death. Judge Mercer leaned forward. Rachel read aloud, "I'm aware my decisions may be questioned. That does not make them uncertain. I leave my estate to Elena because she has been present without condition. She has stayed without expectation." My mother shifted sharply in her seat. Rachel continued, "This is not exclusion. It is consequence." Paul objected. "These are personal writings, not legal instruments." Judge Mercer didn't look up. "They speak directly to intent." Overruled. Rachel turned slightly toward the bench. "Evelyn Brooks spent her career ensuring the record reflected truth," she said. "She understood exactly how stories are distorted when documentation is absent. That is why she left so much of it." The final witness was brief, a retired judge who had once worked with Evelyn as an expert witness. "She was exacting," he testified. "She understood the difference between kindness and control." Paul attempted one last angle. "Isn't it possible age made her inflexible?" The witness met his gaze calmly. "Conviction and inflexibility are not the same." By early afternoon, the room felt settled, as if the arguments had reached their natural limit. Judge Mercer glanced at both tables. Closing arguments. Paul's voice was quieter now, his words carefully restrained. He spoke of regret, of families fractured by distance, of how time could harden decisions made in isolation. Rachel stood last. "This case," she said, "is not about forgiveness. It is about autonomy. Evelyn Brooks exercised hers clearly, consistently, and with full capacity." She gestured briefly toward me. "She did not leave her estate to Elena because she was persuaded. She did so because Elena remained, without demand, without condition." Judge Mercer listened without interruption. When the gavel struck to adjourn for deliberation, no one moved immediately. The sound echoed once, then dissolved. In the hallway, my father approached me. His voice was low, controlled. "You didn't have to take everything," he said. I met his eyes. "She decided what belonged where." He looked away. That evening, back at the house, I didn't open files or replay testimony. I walked through the room slowly, touching familiar surfaces, the banister, the door frame, the edge of the desk where Evelyn had once sat, writing carefully, deliberately. I thought about how thoroughly she had prepared, not for conflict, for clarity. I sat in the study and opened the leather-bound notebook she had given me years earlier. I turned to the final page and read the last line she had written there. "When the truth is tested, stand still, let it speak." I closed the notebook and rested my hands on it, feeling its weight settle, not as burden, but as grounding. Tomorrow, the court would speak. But tonight I understood something with calm certainty. No matter the ruling, the record existed. And once truth is recorded, clearly, consistently, it does not disappear. It waits. The ruling was scheduled for 10 o'clock. No press waited outside the courtroom that morning. No murmured speculation filled the benches. Only the low sound of shoes against stone, the quiet creak of wooden doors opening and closing as people took their seats. I arrived early and sat still, hands folded loosely in my lap. Across the aisle, my parents took their places without looking at me. Their confidence was gone now, replaced by something thinner, restraint holding back disappointment. Judge Harold Mercer entered precisely on time. The room rose, then settled. He adjusted the papers before him, removed his glasses, and looked up. "This court," he began, "has reviewed all testimony, exhibits, correspondence, and medical records submitted in this matter." His voice was calm, unhurried, not the tone of someone preparing a performance, but of someone delivering a conclusion. The plaintiffs allege that Evelyn Brooks executed her final will under undue influence. he continued, specifically that her niece exercised control over access, communication, and decision-making during her later years. He paused briefly. The evidence does not support those claims. I felt my breath slow, each inhale deliberate. What the record shows instead, Judge Mercer said, is a pattern of consistent intent expressed over many years. Ms. Brooks demonstrated full mental capacity and deliberate judgment. My mother's fingers tightened together. Affection does not constitute coercion, he went on. Presence does not negate autonomy, and proximity alone does not establish undue influence. Judge Mercer glanced down once more, then lifted his gaze. This court finds that Evelyn Brooks acted freely, knowingly, and with clear intent. The words landed quietly, but definitively. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed in full. No one moved. The will stands, Judge Mercer said. The estate belongs to Elena Brooks. The gavel struck once. That is the order of this court. My father's shoulders sagged, as if something he had been holding upright finally gave way. My mother stared straight ahead, her expression empty, almost distant. Rachel Kim placed a hand lightly on my arm. I nodded but didn't speak. As the courtroom began to empty, my mother reached out and caught my sleeve. "You think this makes you right," she whispered. "You'll regret this." I met her eyes, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. "She was right," I said quietly. "That's what matters." I stepped away. Outside, the air felt cooler than it had in weeks. The sky was pale, undecided, the city moving on as if nothing had happened at all. Rachel spoke softly. "You handled yourself well." "I learned from her," I replied. Back at the house on Bainbridge Island, the verdict papers rested neatly on Evelyn's desk. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of water moving beyond the trees, steady, unchanged. "You planned for this," I said softly. "Every part of it." That evening, I walked down toward the shoreline alone. The tide moved in and out without urgency. The same sound it had made the day my parents left me there. The same sound it made now. Only my understanding of it had changed. Justice had not arrived loudly. It had arrived precisely. And as the light faded across the water, I realized something that settled into me with calm certainty. The court had spoken. But Evelyn had already resolved this long ago by teaching me how to stand still when the truth was questioned. And that lesson, unlike property or money, could never be taken away. After the ruling, time did not rush forward. Nothing in the house changed immediately. The same light entered through the same windows. The same floorboards creaked beneath familiar steps. The quiet that followed was not heavy. It was spacious, like a room finally cleared of unnecessary furniture. I stayed on Bainbridge Island for several days after the verdict, not out of obligation, but because leaving felt unnecessary. Evelyn had taught me that some moments didn't require movement. They required attention. Rachel called once, brief and professional. "The judgment is final. There will be no appeal." "Thank you," I said, and meant more than the words could hold. When the call ended, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, aware of something unfamiliar. There was no next step waiting, no argument to prepare, no accusation hovering just beyond the edge of thought. That afternoon, I opened the drawers in Evelyn's study, not to search for documents, but to put them away. Folders slid back into place. Envelopes were stacked neatly. The order she had lived by now felt less like preparation and more like reassurance. She had trusted the record to hold. As evening settled, I walked down the narrow path toward the water. The beach was nearly empty, the tide low, the air cool against my skin. I remembered walking this same stretch years earlier, Evelyn beside me, pointing out driftwood shaped by years of patient force. "Things don't become strong by resisting," she had said. "They become strong by enduring." My phone rang as the sky dimmed. It was my father. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "I read her journals," he said quietly. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "All of them." I said nothing. "She wrote that I stopped being her brother long before the will," he continued, "that I chose convenience over responsibility." The words hung between us, stripped of accusation. "She also wrote," I said evenly, "that it's never too late to face the truth. There was a long pause, then a breath. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just needed you to know. I'm sorry." I watched the tide move in, erase its own edge, then retreat again. "I don't know what forgiveness looks like yet," I said, "but pretending nothing happened, isn't it?" "I understand," he replied. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt space. Not emptiness, space. That night, I returned to the study and took out the leather notebook Evelyn had given me years earlier. I hadn't opened it since the verdict. The pages were familiar, her handwriting steady and deliberate. I turned to an entry dated long before she became ill. "When truth is finally spoken, quiet becomes necessary. Don't rush to fill it." I closed the notebook and let the quiet stay. In the days that followed, people reached out. Not reporters, not attorneys, but those who had known Evelyn over the years. Former colleagues, neighbors. People who had relied on her clarity and now wondered what would happen next. I listened more than I spoke. At the first meeting about her small legal aid fund, someone asked gently, "Do you plan to change anything?" "Not yet," I said. No one argued. One evening, as I moved through the house, turning off lights, I paused in the doorway of the study. The desk was clear now, the chair pushed in. Nothing demanded attention. For the first time, the house felt less like a record of the past and more like a place that could hold something new. The case had clarified what my parents had taken and what they hadn't. They had taken time, they had taken certainty, but they hadn't taken what mattered. Standing there, listening to the water beyond the trees, I understood something that settled into me without resistance. Winning the case hadn't filled the absence they left. It had simply named it. And naming it, accurately without distortion, was the first step toward deciding what came next. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't planned. There were no legal deadlines, no documents waiting to be signed, no voices demanding response. The absence of urgency felt unfamiliar at first, like standing on ground that no longer shifted beneath my feet. I began sorting through Evelyn's things again, this time without intention. Not to organize, not to prepare, just to understand her once the noise had passed. Most of what I found was ordinary. Old receipts, notes tucked between the pages of books she had read more than once, letters written in careful handwriting, never hurried, never careless. In a drawer beneath her desk, I found a slim envelope with my name written across the front. No date, no explanation. Inside was a single page. "If you are reading this, Elena, it means the arguing has ended. Don't confuse quiet with emptiness. Quiet is where choice begins." I sat there longer than I meant to, the paper resting lightly in my hands. That evening, I attended my first meeting with the small legal aid group Evelyn had supported for years. The room was modest, folding chairs, mismatched mugs, the faint hum of a space heater in the corner. No one rushed to speak. "I'm not here to replace her," I said when the silence finally turned toward me. "I'm here to continue what she believed mattered." No one disagreed. In the days that followed, I visited places Evelyn had quietly invested in, never with her name attached. A women's clinic, a community mediation center, a scholarship fund for students pursuing public service. At one center, a volunteer looked up from her desk and paused when she saw me. "You're Evelyn Brooks' niece," she said softly. I nodded. "She used to say people don't need to be rescued," the woman continued. "They need to be respected." I smiled. That sounds like her. As autumn edged closer, the house began to feel different. Not lighter, more awake. I moved a chair to catch the afternoon sun, opened windows that had stayed closed through the trial, let the sound of water drift through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. None of it felt like erasing Evelyn. It felt like continuing her. The past still surfaced in small, unexpected ways, a phrase, a sound. The sight of a ferry crossing the Sound could still tighten something in my chest before I realized why. But the memories no longer demanded answers. They simply existed. A letter arrived from my mother near the end of the month. Short, careful, polite. She wrote of regret without naming it, of distance without crossing it. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. Not everything needed a reply. One evening, I walked down toward the shoreline as the sun dipped behind the trees. The sky softened into layers of gray and gold. The water breathed steadily below, unchanged by verdicts or inheritance. I thought about the child I had been, the one who believed survival meant staying quiet, staying small, not asking questions that might not be answered. That child had done her job. She had kept me safe long enough to grow into someone who could choose. Back at the house, I took out the leather notebook Evelyn had given me years earlier. I flipped through its pages slowly, not searching for guidance, not looking for proof. Her words no longer felt like instructions. They felt like confirmation. I closed the notebook and set it on the table beside me. The fight was over. The story wasn't. But whatever came next would not be shaped by fear or by the need to justify a past that had already been recorded clearly. Standing there, listening to the water move in the dark, I understood something that settled into me with quiet certainty. The past no longer needed defending, and the future, for the first time, felt open. The notice arrived on a morning that felt almost ordinary. A thin envelope slipped through the mail slot, its edges clean and impersonal. The seal of King County Superior Court marked the corner. Inside was a single page confirming what had already settled in my mind. The case was officially closed. No appeals, no motions pending, nothing left to contest. I read it once, then set it aside. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like confirmation. That afternoon, I drove into town alone. Bainbridge Island moved at its usual pace, unhurried, coastal, uninterested in anyone else's resolution. People passed without looking. The ferry horn sounded in the distance, steady and familiar. For the first time since the lawsuit began, my last name carried no weight here. I walked down toward the pier and leaned against the railing, watching the water stretch endlessly ahead. Evelyn used to bring me here when I was younger. She rarely spoke during those visits. She said water was useful that way. It didn't argue, didn't remember, didn't demand explanation. "You can't negotiate with what keeps moving," she once told me. "You can only decide where you stand." I thought about the child I had been, standing in a driveway years ago, holding a suitcase and believing that waiting was the same thing as loyalty. I remembered thinking that if I stayed long enough, if I didn't ask too much, someone would come back and explain everything. They never did. Standing there now, older and steadier, I understood something that didn't arrive with anger or blame. They never intended to. The realization didn't hollow me out. It simplified things, like setting down something heavy I hadn't realized I was still carrying. When I returned to the house, Rachel Kim was waiting in the study. She had stopped by to deliver the final documents in person, though we both knew they could have been mailed. "This closes it," she said, placing the folder on the desk. "Legally." I nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated. "Some people will say you were fortunate." I met her eyes. "Fortune doesn't document itself." She smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't." After she left, I opened Evelyn's leather notebook again, not to read, but to feel its familiar weight. The pages were worn, softened by years of turning. I ran my fingers along the margins and thought about how many evenings Evelyn must have sat exactly where I was, writing not because she feared the future, but because she believed in record over reaction. That evening, my phone rang. I saw my mother's name on the screen and let it ring, not out of cruelty, not out of fear, but because I finally understood that some conversations arrive too late to repair what they're meant to heal. Silence, I was learning, wasn't avoidance. It was clarity. As night settled over the house, I sat at the kitchen table where Evelyn and I had shared countless quiet mornings. I imagined her across from me, coffee cooling beside her hand, newspaper folded neatly in front of her. "What aren't they saying?" she would have asked. I smiled softly. They weren't saying that the case hadn't changed me. It had revealed me. I wasn't the child they left behind. I wasn't the defendant they tried to dismantle. I was the person Evelyn had trusted to hold the truth when it mattered. Before heading upstairs, I placed the notebook back on the shelf, not hidden, not displayed, exactly where it belonged. Outside, the water whispered against the shore, steady and indifferent. The same sound it had made the day my parents left. The same sound it made the day the court ruled. Only now, it no longer felt like something was being taken from me. It felt like something had finally been returned. My footing, my direction, my choice to stop waiting for explanations that would never come. And as the lights dimmed and the house settled into its familiar quiet, I knew there was only one part of this story left to tell. Not about courts, not about inheritance, but about what happens when you stop waiting for the past to change and allow yourself to move forward without it. The morning arrived without announcement. Soft light slipped through the windows of the house overlooking the water, settling gently across the floor. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of waves moving against the shore, the familiar creak of the house as it warmed with the day. Nothing was waiting for me anymore. I made coffee and sat at the table where Evelyn used to read the paper, the chair across from me empty but not accusing. It felt complete, like a sentence that had finally reached its end. For years I believed justice would feel louder than this, that there would be a moment when everything aligned and the past loosened its grip all at once. But justice hadn't arrived with force. It had arrived with permission. The permission to stop explaining, the permission to stop defending, the permission to let the past remain exactly what it was, unchanged, but no longer in control. Later that day, I walked down toward the shoreline, the wind steady at my back. The water stretched endlessly ahead, unconcerned with names, money, or verdicts. Evelyn loved that about it. She said it reminded her that certainty was often overrated. "You don't need to be right forever," she once told me. "You just need to be honest when it matters." I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by waiting for my parents to return, waiting for explanations, waiting for something to feel resolved. Standing there now, I understood something with calm clarity. Nothing else was coming, and that was all right. That evening, I returned to the study one last time. I didn't rearrange anything. I didn't remove her belongings. I simply acknowledged them. The books she loved, the files she kept, the careful order she left behind. I took the leather notebook from the shelf and opened it, not to read, but to place one final page inside. A blank sheet except for a single sentence I had written myself. The truth stood when it was tested. I closed the notebook and returned it to its place. Forgiveness, I had learned, was not a finish line. It wasn't something that arrived neatly after justice was served. Sometimes it was only the decision not to reopen a wound that had already stopped bleeding. I didn't forgive my parents that night, but I released the need to be understood by them, and that was enough. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, I stepped outside into the garden. The air was cool, grounding. Somewhere nearby, the roses Evelyn had planted years ago moved gently in the breeze. I realized then what she had truly left me. Not wealth, not protection from loss, but the ability to live without chasing the approval of those who had already chosen to leave. Inside, the house settled into its familiar quiet. I turned off the lights one by one and paused at the doorway, taking in the space, not as something I had inherited, but as something I could now inhabit fully. The story had ended where it was always meant to, not with reconciliation, not with celebration, but with release. And if anyone ever asked me what I gained from the trial, from the inheritance, from the long, difficult unraveling of my family's past, I would know exactly how to answer. I gained the courage to stop waiting for people to change. I gained the clarity to move forward without needing their permission. I gained my life back. The water whispered below, steady as ever. And for the first time, I didn't listen for echoes. I listened to myself, and that was enough.